Good morning. I definitely don't want to be keeping you from any gatherings with other believers this glorious Sunday morning. But I just returned last night from the Northwest and have had a lot of, this is a sloth, a weighted sloth, by the way, from a dear sister in Texas. Um, so, during my trip, I had I was asked some questions, and I didn't have the greatest technology with me. I still don't. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. Just realized I'm not using the mic. Um, I'll just try this one without the mic, and the rest I'll put in the mic. Um, there were some questions asked that I really wanted to answer, and so as I put in the notes here, the first question, it was right when I was pulling up and waiting for a parking spot at my mom's building, that I saw in Facebook Messenger. A brother had reached out, and so I had a brief conversation with him. And he asked, he's been watching my videos. I like my little sign that says I am held, so I'm gonna there. Um, so we had a brief conversation, and he asked, if he said, I understand that your situation involves a very difficult marriage situation. So he said, if that were to be resolved, would you go back to the meetings? Is it mainly about your marriage? And so I told him it's not about my marriage, nor is it about the meetings, or at least this is what I would summarize telling him. It's about abuse, and lies. So if abuse and lies were to be remedied, then I could meet with anybody, and and there would be no problem in my marriage. And so I just want to read to you. I just did a quick Google search for abusive patterns in unhealthy churches. So if these things were resolved, or if these things don't exist, then I have no problem meeting with any believers. So, because I think these things prevent the oneness of the body of Christ. So this is just from AI, like we're doing a Google search, abusive patterns in unhealthy churches. And you could probably also put in abusive patterns in unhealthy marriages. Maybe I'll do that as well. But one, controlling leadership, hierarchical structures. Unhealthy churches often have a rigid hierarchy where leaders make decisions without input from members. Demand for unquestioning loyalty. Leaders may require unwavering obedience and discourage questions or doubts. So if we have a situation where questions and doubts are not considered rebellion, then that could solve a lot. Okay, this is all under controlling leadership. The third point under controlling leadership, manipulation and control. Leaders may use guilt, fear, or promises to manipulate members into following their agenda. Sometimes that manipulation is also just feeling, safe, or like you're part of the in group. You're included in those, little outings, or anyway, to question or to express doubts could leave you unincluded. And then the fourth, under controlling leadership, accountability issues. Leaders are often not held accountable for their actions, fostering a sense of impunity. So if the leaders are all held accountable for their actions and there's not a sense of impunity, then I think that I could meet with any believers. So number two, Scare tactics, using religious teachings or fear of divine punishment to control members. When I visited my mom, she was just finishing a meeting with Vespers, which is, I think that's a general name for a meeting, but in her senior living. And a dear brother, a dear believer, was leaving with his, is it yarmulke on? Anyway, he's a rabbi. He's a Messianic Jew, and he's a teacher. And I know it says not to call anyone rabbi, but he tells people the real rabbi, you've all met him, and his name is Jesus. Anyway, so but he was sharing, and the believers that were in that gathering at Vespers were just, several of them talked to me about it, that live in my mom's building. And one of the takeaways was the phrase that is the most common in the Bible is do not fear or do not be afraid. And so God doesn't use fear tactics to control us. He doesn't want us to be afraid. He uses love. Anyway, so unhealthy churches use the abusive pattern of scare tactics, including religious teachings or fear of divine punishment to control members. Secondly, under manipulation and control, unhealthy churches use shaming and belittling. They use public humiliating or criticizing of members who disagree with the church's teachings. Okay, not with the biblical, but with, particularly in the group, the Lord's Recovery, who disagree with Witness Lee's teachings. Those have become the church's teachings, that group's teachings, and they consider themselves the church, the only church. But if you disagree with Witness Lee or Watchman Nee's teachings, then you may be publicly humiliated or criticized. And we'll get back to that, but maybe I'll make reference to it. I got to visit believers who call themselves the Church in Moses Lake because they don't want to take any other name. And that's what my parents were looking for, is, people who practice that, but that are one with all believers. Okay, this group is considered illegitimate in the Lord's Recovery. It was one of the sweetest gatherings I've been to. And I almost couldn't go. I told Steve Isett, who meets there, I said, I can't go if there's anything weird because I'll be so triggered. But I said, but I'll try because I love believers and I love Jesus. If Jesus is there, that's where my joy is. He's where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. Well, I went in and just people were casually gathering, talking, and we sat down. And the first song we sang was, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have Jesus. Anyway, look it up. It's so beautiful. I'd rather have Jesus. And I recorded a little bit of that singing. Now, that gathering is in the Lord's Recovery considered to be illegitimate because in the 80s, Ken Sandberg, who was there in that meeting, and he's now around 90 years old, he was in a meeting of elders where Witness Lee said, if you don't 100% follow my ministry, then just leave now, leave by whatever time PM. And he and another elder from Moses Lake left. But they continued meeting and even enjoying parts of, quote, the ministry that this group calls, Witness Lee and Watchman Nee's teachings. But they couldn't commit to absolute and exclusive following of one man's teachings. But that is a beautiful gathering of believers in the Lord's name. And so they have been publicly humiliated or criticized for disagreeing with Witness Lee's, ultimatum. But they're precious believers meeting in the Lord's name. So I call that a church, and I call the public humiliating and criticizing, I call that manipulation and control, which should not be in the church. Okay, use of religious jargon, employing religious language to create a sense of fear, intimidation, or guilt. Very much so. use of religious jargon. I welcome you to put examples in the chat. But, overcomers, the kingdom, deputy authority, God's governmental dealings, various things, most of which have Old Testament examples, but employing religious language to create a sense of fear, intimidation, or guilt. Again, the most common phrase in the Bible is "do not be afraid." And we fear God, but we are not to fear man. And I was thinking of something else related to that, employing religious language to create a sense of fear, intimidation, and guilt. Oh, yes, related to overcomers. I was listening to, when I was driving, I would listen to just a little bit of Christian radio, and someone was sharing the verse, "He always gives us triumph." Who, thanks be to God, who always leads us in victory. He always leads us in triumph in Christ. So when we are following God, we always have victory. Okay, and then another point under manipulation and control is isolation. Encouraging members to isolate themselves from outside influences or from those who disagree with the church's teachings. Again and again and again, I've heard stories now of people being told not to associate with believers who disagree with the church's teachings, with Witness Lee's teachings. Also, we are discouraged from mingling with others. I will say a pretty personal example, but my husband, for the most part, grew up without his biological dad, who is a very dear believer and who now has his PhD in psychology and helps people who've gone through trauma. But my husband and his full brother were discouraged from spending time with him because this is the reason I was told from my husband's mother, is because she didn't want them to be influenced away from the church. So the church being the local church. So forfeit the relationship with their biological dad because she didn't want them confused because he wasn't in the church. That is isolating boys from their daddy. And it goes on to this day. My son asked a very dear brother if what he thought, an elder and a coworker. It was Dick Taylor. But he asked Dick once when my son was in high school, and Dick was is an elder here in LA. He asked, "What do you think about me going to church with my friend? He invited me." And Nathan's answer was, "It's risky, or that's dangerous." So risky or dangerous. Nathan just told me that within this last year, that he was told to go to church with his friend Young, a believer in Christ, was dangerous. So that is encouraging members to isolate themselves from outside influences, even if they're friends and family members who are believers, or those who disagree with church's teachings, very much including those who were once in the group but who disagree with something. They are encouraged to isolate themselves from those. And that can be called excommunicating. It can be called shunning. It can be called quarantining. But if you disagree with the church's teachings, people will be encouraged to isolate themselves from you. And I am an example, okay? Very, very, very little contact with the hundreds of people in that group with whom I believe I was close. But because I'm speaking out in disagreement about some things, I am isolated from those people. Okay, so that is the second of these two first points from AI's overview. And AI's overview is from articles and writings that are on, through Google. But controlling leadership is number one. Misuse of spiritual authority is that was number three. Manipulation and control is number two. Number three, misuse of spiritual authority. False prophecies or revelations. Leaders may claim to have direct communication with God or use religious teachings to justify their actions. So again and again and again, we hear that we have the high peak of the divine revelation in the Holy Scriptures, or we have the high peak, and other Christians don't have the high peak. Okay, so there's anyway, exploitation. Leaders may exploit members financially, emotionally, sexually, using their spiritual authority as a tool for control. Okay, another thing, exploitation. I visited a friend during this trip in the Northwest. She told me, Ruth, you talked about being measured by Philip Lee. Well, that was in the spring for me, in a spring break trip. She said that summer I was measured by Philip Lee, and there was a whole line of sisters being measured uniquely by Philip Lee. And she said, all I wondered was, why is a brother doing this? She said, but he didn't like finger me and stuff, but he did measure my breasts, my chest, and over my breasts and my waist and my thighs. And he did that to the whole line of sisters. And I just asked her, okay, would your dad ever have done that? She goes, oh, no way. My dad was so modest, or is so modest. And I said, would any other brother do that? I said, think of any brother you know. Would they have measured your breasts and your thighs and your waist? She goes, no. But somehow Philip Lee had a whole lineup of young sisters. Okay, that was using spiritual position, quote, quote, spiritual position, spiritual authority. He was in a position of authority spiritually because elders were being told at that time to report to him. And he was measuring a lot of sisters, not just me. I was just alone with Naomi Hunt there, taking down my measurements while he touched these private areas. But there was a whole lineup of sisters, and he was doing it to them. And I think I asked her, were any other brothers around? And she doesn't remember any brother being around. Somehow he had a position to measure all these sisters with no brothers around, who I don't think would have allowed it. Okay. Blame the victim. So false prophecies or revelations, this is misuse of spiritual authority. False prophecies or revelations, exploitation, and blaming the victim. And by the way, exploitation, a lot of financial exploitation and emotional exploitation. And people say, well, file a claim with the police. How do you prove emotional exploitation in a religious setting? How does Joe Castile appeal to the police for emotional exploitation or for her observation of sexual exploitation in the full-time training? Anyway, how do any of us do that? But I see the songs going on. Robert Taylor making these songs, and then the criticism, of course, going on of the songs being written. They're poetic representations of human sentiments, but I believe mingled with God's sentiments because they match our conscience and they match the Bible. The sentiments being expressed, yes, through the use of AI. So is this list. It's the use of AI, but I wouldn't read it if I don't agree with it. I will correct it, or I'll adjust it, because I'm the human here, but I'm using a tool. Okay, so blaming the victim. Leaders may blame victims of abuse for their suffering or for the church's abusive practices. Blaming the victim. I have been blamed so much, and I would say anyone who speaks out about abuse is blamed for maybe not covering either. Sorry, my mouth is dry. I haven't even drunk much this morning. This has been on my heart, but after I got a good night's sleep, I just felt to record these question and answer videos that have been going through me. Blaming the victim, blaming for being unsubmissive, blaming for not covering, blaming for being rebellious, blaming for being, having unfulfilled ambitions or unforgiven offenses, Why don't you just forgive? Blaming victims for opposing the Lord's recovery. So that's going to be another video. Someone asking me, why do you oppose the Lord's recovery? I don't oppose. I don't oppose the Lord's recovery. I oppose abuse. I oppose these abusive patterns in unhealthy churches. And if you don't oppose these, then what kind of recovery are you in? Okay, so there's so many examples of leaders blaming victims of abuse for their suffering. Oh yeah, telling me if I don't get rid of my dog, I will never know what Jesus can be to me. When my husband is threatening to kill himself if I keep my dog. And this was from an elder, and I believe you could call him a coworker and a medical doctor in Anaheim. Ruth, if you don't get rid of Riley, you'll never know what Jesus can be to you. And maybe he said in that respect or in that area. It sounds godly, but it's blaming me for not knowing, keeping something in place of Jesus. In Moses Lake, I sang, I'd rather have Jesus than anything the world provides. But they're not going to ask me, get rid of your dog that the doctors say has medicinal effects on you because of what you're going through. The dog is medicinal for you, but get rid of it. Maybe then get rid of any medicine because you wouldn't know what Jesus can be to you if you keep taking that medicine. That's blaming victims of abuse or for their suffering because they're not maybe loving Jesus enough, wanting Jesus enough. Okay, other red flags. Maybe I won't expound so much. I don't even know how long this video is. I'm not watching myself. I'm looking at the Google list. Disregard for individual well-being. The brief explanation is the church's focus is on conformity and loyalty rather than the health and well-being of its members. Thank you, church members in the local church in Los Angeles, for cooking for my husband while I was not allowed in my home. There was an ice box outside my home that said his name, and sisters would leave meals for him. As soon as I returned, the meals stopped, and he blamed me. If you didn't come back, I'd still be getting meals from sisters. Well, he also told me not to cook for him, and he told me there's no sharing of food through an attorney. So, but somehow because I returned, the meals stopped. Because I guess I don't conform. I'm not sure, like why the care. But anyway, that's just a small example. The church's focus is on conformity and loyalty rather than the health and well-being of its members. The health, the well-being. Ruth isn't being allowed in her home. Her husband changed the locks, is saying that I have to give 2 months notice to be able to come by my house. But I guess she's supposed to submit and conform and be loyal and literally potentially go insane, not have a home. My children have to watch that. Their mom couch surfing for months and months. The police said, ma'am, they could be arrested for doing this. Go home. I went home and I was treated poorly again. But the church's focus is on conformity and loyalty rather than the health and well-being of its members. And I'm just using my very personal example, but it's not my vendetta. It's just one of so many examples of caring for conformity and loyalty rather than health and well-being of its members. Lack of transparency, another red flag. The church's financial records, governance structures, and leadership practices are often kept secret or opaque. Okay, full disclosure. Full disclosure, please. That goes on the family level. A husband should not be hiding financial records from me, from wives, from me as a wife. A lot of governance, even in leadership practices, not so clear. And yet Christianity is criticized for having hierarchical structures. Well, I mean, maybe they have certain people in positions, but at least they're clear about it. They're transparent. Bye, sweetie. Love you. That was my daughter. And then inability or unwillingness to address abuse allegations. Oh my goodness. Other red flags. Inability or unwillingness to address abuse allegations. Instead, whistleblowers are shamed, ostracized, isolated. There are abuse allegations out there. So that's my very long and incomplete answer to the dear brother who reached out saying, if everything was resolved in your marriage, would you go back to the meetings? Yes, as long as there are none of these things. And if these things are in, of course, you're going to say they're in every group. There's abuse in every group. But if it's on the leadership level or I detect it, I'm no longer comfortable because I'm no longer safe. And my kids would not be safe. And their mother would not be safe, and they care about their mom. And these abusive practices have a ripple effect that affect, I would say, the ripple effect by definition is basically it goes on forever. So they've got to be addressed and they have to be stopped. And the only thing I know to do is to call it out. So yes, I'd meet with any believer, but I'd also say, I'm concerned about this. And if they isolate me, if I notice something and I'm concerned about it, if I'm isolated for that and punished and blamed and all that, then no, I wouldn't meet with those believers until those matters would be properly addressed. And there could be transparency and a regard for individual well-being and the ability to address abuse allegations and a proper use of authority, and no manipulation and control, because you know what? God doesn't manipulate and control. Why should any person? And no controlling leadership. Then yes, absolutely. Thanks for listening, and thanks for that question, brother. Take care. See if I can find where to stop this video, if it's even recording. I'm not very techy. Found it. Stay healthy. Spirit, soul, body, entire being, and your family. By the way, we're not just spirit, soul, and body. We also are, I love Dan Siegel's work. We're also community, and that affects health too. So we are not just individuals. We are in society, and that's how God made us. So if our society isn't healthy, we also are not healthy. Okay, you have to choose healthy society. So anyway, I'm going to go. I did find where to end this video, and I have more questions and answers I want to answer, or more questions I want to answer. Thank you.